Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the three major types of conflict that you can have in a story. Now, these are very broad categories, as you might guess, considering that there are only three of them that include basically all of the stories that have ever been told or could ever be told. But these are useful frameworks for thinking about conflict within stories, not only as a reader of stories, but as a writer of stories as well. So, the three major types of conflict are person versus person, person versus nature, and person versus self. These were traditionally called man versus, but since many protagonists are not male, I'm going to use the term person. It's worth noting not all protagonists are people. There are stories like, for instance, George Saunders's novella Fox 8, where the protagonist might be an animal, or the protagonist might be some sort of non-human entity, something like this. But these are all, I'm going to use the term person because most stories told by people are about people. If it helps you to sort of, in your mind, substitute some sort of larger term, being, entity, something like that, have at it. I'm happy for you to do that. So, these conflicts all center around the struggles of a protagonist. So that's the first term that we want to define here. A protagonist is the being whose story we are interested in, the primary character whose actions and worldview we are following within a story. Sometimes this is a hero. Sometimes hero is not necessarily the right word, but it is the central figure nonetheless. And then when we talk about conflict, when I say three types of conflict, stories revolve around tensions. There will be some kind of problem or challenge or obstacle that exists, and whether or not the protagonist will successfully navigate that challenge is basically the core of the story. Sometimes the structure is less straightforward and clear than that, but that's essentially what goes into stories by and large. So, we know what a protagonist is, we know what conflict is. The differences in the three types of conflict are really where that conflict is located relative to the protagonist. So with person versus person stories, the conflict is with an antagonist. So if the protagonist is the person or the being whose story we are interested in, the antagonist is the source of conflict, another person typically, or another being, whatever it is. So in this conflict structure, the problem is interpersonal, that is between two people. The protagonist versus the antagonist. This can be any number of things, ranging from sort of heroes and villains stories, in which you have a good character fighting for truth, justice, and the American way, or whatever it is, versus an evil character seeking profit, destruction, and greed, or whatever it is. All the way down to more moderate conflicts over disagreements or a character just sort of standing in another character's way without malicious intent necessarily. So person versus person conflicts are very, very, very common in literature, films, TV, video games, mass media of all kinds. Person versus person, probably one of the most common types of conflict. This is what you tend to get in Westerns, right? Wyatt Earp versus Ike Clanton. This is what you tend to get in action movies. John McClane versus whichever villain he happens to be facing in this Die Hard movie, whether that's Hans Gruber or whoever it is. You tend to get person versus person conflicts in superhero stories. Batman versus the Joker, Spider-Man versus Doc Ock, etc., etc. So these types of genres tend to be driven by person versus person conflict, where you have clear protagonists and antagonists. The second category of conflict is person versus nature, and this can be in two senses. One may be, and these senses are interconnected, so I don't want to sort of give the sense that these are two definitely distinct things, but we can think about them along two different paths. One is a sort of literal person versus nature, where we're talking about the environment, the natural world. Trees, bunnies, streams, things like that. They're often more perilous than that. It might be a crevasse in which someone is trapped, or the Alaskan wilderness, or whatever it is. So stories in which the natural world itself is the source of antagonism, is the thing that threatens the protagonist. But then we've also got more sort of existentially oriented stories in which some large impersonal force in the universe is the antagonist. This may be something like disease. This may be something like a new idea that threatens the protagonist. This may be something like angst, sort of existential dread or something like this. But this could also be, you've also got person versus nature stories that sort of straddle the line, where you have an impersonal and unknowable force that is somehow natural, but also defies traditional explanations. So, in this instance, we have an external conflict, but not with a person, not with another person, rather with some sort of force outside of the protagonist. So, survival stories tend to be one. Things like Hatchet, for instance. The genre, I feel like there was a genre back in like the late 80s into the 90s of like lost animal movies. Journey Home, something like that, was one where there was like a puppy and a kitten who had to like walk across the country to get home or something like that. That doesn't sound like exactly the right title, but if you're really interested, you can look it up. So those sort of survival stories in which nature is, the natural world is what threatens you. A lot of Canadian literature, early Canadian literature especially, is in this vein. What Northrop Frye called the garrison mentality, in which nature itself is scary. But then there's also, again, these more existential stories where you have some sort of force of the universe, or some sort of impersonal antagonistic force. So stories of disease. Albert Camus' The Plague, for instance, is a good example of this. But also stories in which the antagonist might be said to be socio-cultural, like a force within society more than something from the natural world. So stories where the main opponent is racism, for instance. Maybe Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man goes in this category. Stories where the force of religion is the main problem, or the force of nationalism, something like this. And then, of course, directly existential stories. Not Camus. Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, for instance. The central problem there is the meaninglessness of existence. But then you've got, again, these stories that sort of straddle those two gaps between the natural world as such and the existential angst side. And that would be things like alien invasions, where aliens just come for no reason. Independence Day, for instance. Like, we don't ever get a sense that these aliens have any particular goal. They probably do, but we don't know it, and we can't know it, is the premise. Creature features are another one. Things like Godzilla, Devil from the Green Hell, I think is an old schlock movie that's in this vein. Any of these sort of, here's this inexplicably existing monstrous creature. These kinds of things are person versus nature, I would say, even though we could also make a case that they are person versus maybe person, in that there is a concrete singular antagonist in something like Godzilla, Jaws, something like that. So that's the second one, person versus nature. The third main conflict is person versus self. So here the conflict, the tension, the problem is internalized. This may be about trying to overcome some sort of problem or limitation. This may be about trying to come to terms with guilt. This may be about trying to even find one's place in the universe, something like this. But the primary issue being experienced by the protagonist is an internal one. There's an argument to be made, I would say, that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is in this category. Other things that would be in this category would be coming-of-age stories often, although they generally have an external protagonist, or external antagonist, sorry, or sort of external antagonistic force, if it's not an individual antagonist. Something like The Sandlot is in this vein, I would say, person versus self primarily, because it's about the protagonist trying to sort of come of age, trying to find his place in this community and sort of become a confident adult, etc., etc. So these kinds of stories, coming of age stories, but also stories of sort of guilt, stories of overcoming challenges or limitations self-imposed, these kinds of things. So these are the three big plot lines, the big conflict structures for stories. Again, this is useful to know as a reader because you can sort of orient yourself in terms of what this plot line is doing, what this conflict is doing, and how or why. But it's also useful as a writer because you can take this knowledge to help you structure your own stories.